The iron citadel breathed in rhythm with the winter, cold, jagged, and unforgiving. Inside its obsidian walls, Cassian Wolfthorne, the Alpha King, sat upon a throne of ancient bone, his presence a heavy weight that silenced the very air. He was a man of scars and silence, a ruler whose heart had been turned to stone by a curse that demanded he reign alone. Below him, the servants moved like shadows, terrified of the beast that lived beneath his skin. But in the eyes of a child, even a monster can look like a legend waiting to be told. The morning air in the lower kitchens of the iron citadel tasted of wood smoke and damp stone. Melisande Thornbrook worked with a rhythmic, desperate efficiency, her hands red from the icy water of the wash basin. Around her, the other maids whispered in hushed tones, their voices fluttering like trapped birds. The Alpha King was returning from the northern marches. Melisande didn't join the gossip. She kept her head down, the collar of her gray woolen dress pulled high, hiding the jagged silver lines that crept up the side of her neck. To most, it looked like an old burn from a kitchen fire. To her, it was a secret that pulsed with every beat of her heart, a tether to a life she had tried to bury 5 years ago. "Mama, look!" Evelina, barely 4 years old with eyes the color of a stormy sea, held up a piece of charcoal she'd found near the hearth. She had drawn a crude shape on the stone floor, a wolf with a crown. "Shh, Evelina," Melisande whispered, her heart skipping. She wiped her hands on her apron and knelt beside the girl. "We must be quiet today. The great hall is being prepared. The king's general, Evander Greyford, is already at the gates. We cannot be seen out of place." Evelina tilted her head, her dark curls bouncing. "Is the king big, Mama? Is he scary like the stories?" Melisande looked at the charcoal wolf. She remembered the stories of a king whose roar could split the mountains, whose touch was fire, and whose soul was bound by a law so ancient it predated the stars. "He is just a man with a very heavy burden, little bird. Now, help me gather the linens. We must be gone before the procession enters." But the citadel was a labyrinth of sound and scent. As they moved through the servants' corridor, the heavy thrum of boots began to shake the floorboards. The scent of pine, cold iron, and something primal, something that smelled like the very essence of the forest, began to fill the halls. Cassian Wolfthorne was not just home. He was near. Melisande pulled Evelina into the alcove of a great pillar, her breath hitching. She could see them now through the archway, the elite guard, their silver armor glinting in the dim torchlight. At the center walked Cassian. He was taller than she remembered from the distant glimpses she'd caught over the years. His hair was black as a raven's wing, his eyes a piercing, predatory amber. He didn't look like a man, he looked like a storm given human form. As he passed, the air grew thin. Melisande pressed her back against the cold stone, her hand over Evelina's mouth to keep the girl from gasping. She felt the mark on her neck throb, a dull, aching heat that she hadn't felt in years. It was reacting to him. It was recognizing its master. Beside him, Evander Greyford spoke in low, urgent tones about the border disputes with the Ravenswood clan, but Cassian seemed not to hear. He stopped. His head turned slightly, his nostrils flaring. He was catching a scent. Melisande froze. "Please," she prayed to the old gods, "let us be invisible." Cassian's eyes scanned the shadows. For a terrifying second, those amber orbs seemed to lock onto the very pillar where they hid. Then, Leopold Valahart, the king's advisor, stepped forward, breaking the tension with a scroll in hand. "Sire, the feast is prepared. The elders await your word on the succession laws." Cassian's jaw tightened. "Succession!" he spat, his voice a low growl that vibrated in Melisande's bones. "They want an heir for a throne that brings nothing but blood. Let them wait." He moved on, his cape sweeping the floor like a dark wing. Melisande collapsed against the stone, her legs trembling. She didn't notice that Evelina was no longer looking at the king's face, but at his hand. At the back of his wrist where a sliver of silver skin peeked out from his gauntlet. The mark. The same mark Melisande spent every day hiding. The feast in the great hall was a cacophony of clashing silver and boisterous laughter, yet a shroud of tension hung over the high table. Cassian Wolfthorne sat in the center, drinking dark ale from a chalice, his expression unreadable. He hated these gatherings. They were reminders of what he lacked, a mate, A pack heart, a reason to be more than a weapon for his people. Callista Ravenswood, a guest of diplomatic necessity, sat to his left, her silk gown whispering against the floor. She watched him with calculating eyes, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "You seem distant, Alpha," she remarked. "The war is over. You should be celebrating." "The war in the woods is over," Cassian replied, his voice flat. "The war within is perpetual." Down in the lower tiers of the hall, the servants moved in a blur of service. Melisande was among them, carrying a heavy tray of roasted meats. She had tried to leave Evelina in the nursery, but the girl had slipped out, following the scent of the honey cakes that always accompanied the king's feasts. Melisande scanned the room frantically while pouring wine for a minor lord. She spotted a flash of a small blue dress near the base of the dais. Her heart nearly stopped. Evelina was standing mere feet from the king's throne. The girl wasn't afraid. To her, the Alpha King was a puzzle. She watched him as he set his chalice down. She watched the way he moved, his hand resting on the arm of the chair. The gauntlet was off now, his bare hand exposed to the firelight. "Sir?" The small voice was like a pebble dropped into a silent pool. The laughter at the high table died down. Evander leaned forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his dagger. Leopold frowned. Cassian looked down. His amber eyes narrowed as he beheld the tiny child standing before him. "Who allowed this?" Leopold demanded, looking around for a parent. Cassian raised a hand, silencing his advisor. He leaned forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over Evelina. "You are far from the kitchens, little one," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, though still edged with the roughness of the wild. Evelina didn't flinch. She pointed a small charcoal-stained finger at the king's wrist. On the pale skin of his inner arm was a mark, a series of interlocking silver lines that looked like lightning frozen in time. "Sir," Evelina said, her voice clear and bright in the sudden silence of the hall, "my mom has a mark just like yours, except hers is on her neck." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a held breath before a scream. Melisande, standing by the wine casks, felt the world tilt. The tray in her hands slipped, clattering to the stone floor. The sound of silver hitting stone echoed like a death knell. Cassian's head snapped toward the sound. His eyes, usually so cold, ignited with a terrifying golden light. He stood up, the chair scraping back with a violent screech. He didn't look at the child anymore. He looked at the woman in the gray dress, her face pale as death, her hand instinctively flying to her collar. "You," Cassian breathed. The word wasn't a question, it was a realization. Evander stepped down from the dais, his eyes wide. "Sire, surely it's a mistake. A scar, perhaps." "No," Cassian growled. He stepped off the dais, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. He walked toward Melisande, his pace slow and predatory. Every step seemed to vibrate through her skin. Melisande wanted to run. She wanted to grab Evelina and disappear into the snow-choked woods, but her feet were rooted to the spot. As the king approached, the mark on her neck didn't just ache, it burned. A searing, white-hot heat that made her vision swim. Cassian stopped inches from her. The scent of him, musk, rain, and power, overwhelmed her. He reached out, his large calloused hand hovering near her throat. "Show me," he commanded. "Please," Melisande whispered, her voice breaking. "She's just a child. She doesn't know what she's saying." "Show me," he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate register. With trembling fingers, Melisande slowly reached for the high collar of her dress. She pulled the wool aside, exposing the silver lines that danced across her skin. The hall gasped. It was the mark of the shattered moon, the sign of the Alpha's true mate. A mark thought to have been lost to the royal bloodline generations ago. Cassian's fingers finally touched her skin. The moment his flesh met hers, a shockwave of energy erupted between them. The torches in the hall flared bright blue, and a low, resonant hum shook the foundations of the citadel. Cassian's eyes widened, his pupils blowing wide until his eyes were almost entirely black. "I have searched the 4 kingdoms for you," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of awe and fury. "And you were scrubbing my floors." The private solar of the Alpha King was a place of shadows and flickering firelight. It was a room designed for strategy and isolation, but tonight it felt like a cage. Melisande stood by the hearth, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Evelina had been taken to a guest chamber under the watchful, if confused, care of Evander. Now it was just Melisande and the king. Cassian paced the length of the room, his movements restless. He had shed his heavy furs, wearing only a dark tunic that showed the tension in his shoulders. He looked like a wolf pacing a perimeter. "Why?" he finally asked, stopping to look at her. "Why hide?" You knew what that mark meant. Every child in this kingdom is taught the legend of the moonbound. "I knew what the legend said," Melisande replied, her voice gaining a flicker of strength. "I also knew what happened to the last woman who bore that mark. She was hunted. She was used as a political pawn until she broke. I didn't want that for myself, and I certainly didn't want it for my daughter." Cassian's eyes darkened at the mention of the child. "The girl, she is mine?" Melisande looked into the fire. "No, not by blood. She is the daughter of a man I met in the southern villages, a man who treated me with kindness when I was running from the ghost of this mark. He passed before she was born." A strange flicker passed over Cassian's face. Was it relief or disappointment? But the mark, it stayed. "It never fades," she said softly. "It waited. It pulsed whenever you were near. I thought if I stayed in the shadows, I could outrun destiny." Cassian walked toward her, stopping just outside her personal space. "Destiny cannot be outrun, Melisande. It is carved into our very souls. My people believe I am cursed because I have no queen. The elders whisper that the line of Wolfthorne will end with me because the moon hasn't chosen." He reached out, his thumb tracing the air near her mark. "But she did choose. She chose a maid." "A maid can never be a queen," Melisande said, repeating the laws of the Vale elders. "The bloodlines must be pure. Leopold will never allow it." "Leopold does not wear the crown," Cassian growled. He stepped closer, forcing her to look up at him. "And he does not feel the pull of the bond. From the moment I entered the hall today, my wolf has been screaming. He knows you. He has always known you." Melisande felt her heart hammering against her ribs. The fear was still there, but beneath it was something else, a strange, magnetic pull that drew her toward him. She wanted to lean into his strength, to let the fire of his presence warm the winter that had lived in her bones for 5 years. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Cassian said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive rumble, "you move from the kitchens to the royal wing. You will be fed, you will be clothed, and you will be protected. And I will spend every day convincing you that you belong by my side." "And if I refuse?" Cassian leaned down, his breath warm against her ear. "You can try to refuse the king, Melisande, but you cannot refuse the moon. We are bound by more than just laws." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "One more thing. Your daughter, she has a brave spirit. She did what no warrior in this kingdom dared to do. She looked me in the eye and told me the truth." He closed the door, leaving Melisande alone with the crackling fire. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the scent of a changing season. The secret was out, the hunt was over, but the real struggle, the struggle to survive the weight of a crown and the heat of a bond, had only just begun. Melisande touched her mark. For the first time, it didn't feel like a scar, it felt like a promise. The ivory suite was a masterpiece of architecture and isolation, perched high in the north tower where the wind sang a constant morning dirge. For Melisande, the transition from the soot-stained kitchens to these chambers was not a climb, but a dizzying fall into a world where every surface was too bright and every silence too heavy. The air here didn't smell of roasting meat or damp earth. It smelled of dried lavender, ancient parchment, and the cold, sharp scent of the stars. Evelina, however, saw only magic. The girl had spent the morning bouncing on the massive bed, its silk sheets rippling like the surface of a mountain lake. To her, the citadel was no longer a place of shadows to be avoided, but a playground of endless wonder. She had already befriended 2 of the younger chambermaids, who looked at the girl with a mixture of awe and pity, knowing the weight of the mark she had revealed to the world. Melisande stood by the window, her fingers tracing the frost patterns on the glass. She wore a dress of deep midnight blue, a gift from the king's private stores, that felt like a second skin, heavy and unfamiliar. The high collar was gone, replaced by a delicate lace that teased the edges of her silver mark. She felt exposed, a nerve ending stripped of its protective sheath. A sharp rap on the door broke her reverie. It wasn't the heavy rhythmic thud of the king's boots, nor the light step of a servant. It was precise, authoritative. "Enter," Melisande said, her voice sounding small in the vast room. Leopold Valhart stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a finality that made her heart race. The king's advisor was a man of silver hair and sharp angles, his eyes like polished flint. He did not look at the luxury of the room. He looked only at her, as if dissecting a specimen. "The girl is asleep?" Leopold asked, his voice a dry rustle. "She is in the inner chamber, yes," Melisande replied, standing her ground. Leopold walked toward the hearth, the firelight casting long, distorted shadows across his face. "You understand, of course, that this situation is highly irregular. The laws of the Wolfthorne lineage are older than the stones of this fortress. They were written in blood to ensure that the Alpha's strength remains untainted by the common pulse." "I never asked for the mark, Lord Valahart," Melisande said, her voice gaining a sharp edge. "I spent 5 years trying to scrub it away with lye and ash. If your laws find me lacking, then let us go. Give us a horse and a week's rations, and you will never see us again." Leopold turned, a cold smile touching his lips. "If it were only a matter of law, I would have had you escorted to the border the moment the king left the hall. But it is a matter of the moon. The bond is a physical reality, Melisande. If I send you away, the king will follow. He will leave his throne, his people, and his duty to chase the scent of your skin. And in his absence, the Ravenswood clan will descend like vultures." He stepped closer, the heat of the fire between them. "You are not a queen. You are a tether. If you break, he breaks, and if he breaks, the kingdom falls. Do not mistake his obsession for affection. A wolf does not love the air he breathes. He simply requires it to survive." The words felt like ice shards in her chest. Melisande looked away, her gaze falling on the door to Evelina's room. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to remember your place," Leopold whispered. "Stay in these rooms. Do not attend the councils. Do not speak to the lords. Let the king satisfy this primal urge until the moon wanes and his senses return. Perhaps then we can find a way to mitigate this mistake." He left without another word, leaving the scent of old dust in the air. Melisande sank into a chair, her hand trembling as it went to her neck. The mark burned again, but this time it wasn't a warning. It was a hunger. She could feel Cassian through the walls, a low, thrumming vibration of power and frustration. He was coming. And as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the mountains, the heavy door groaned on its hinges. Cassian Wolfthorne stood in the doorway, his eyes already glowing with that terrifying, beautiful amber light. "He was here," Cassian growled, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on her. "Leopold, I can smell his stagnancy." "He was only reminding me of the law," Melisande said, standing up. Cassian crossed the room in 3 strides, his presence filling the space until she felt as though she were standing at the edge of a cliff. He reached out, his hand cupping her jaw, his thumb dragging across the silver lines of her mark. "The law is a ghost," he whispered, his voice vibrating through her. "You are the only thing that is real." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. For a moment, the world of politics and maids and crowns vanished. There was only the heat of him, the frantic rhythm of her own heart, and the soft, distant sound of a wolf beginning to howl in the valley below. The following days were a blur of lessons and silent confrontations. Cassian, determined to bridge the chasm between them, insisted on spending the twilight hours with Melisande in the great library. It was a cavernous space, filled with the scent of leather, vanilla, and thyme. "Tell me about the man," Cassian said one evening, his large hands carefully turning the brittle pages of an ancient manuscript. "The father of the child." Melisande sat across from him, a book of poetry unopened in her lap. "His name was Thomas. He was a woodcutter in the southern Vales. He knew nothing of alphas or marks. He only knew that I was cold and hungry, and he shared his hearth with me." "Did you love him?" The question was blunt, devoid of the usual royal decorum. Melisande looked into the firelight. "I loved the peace he gave me. He didn't look at me as a destiny or a curse. To him, I was just Melisande. He died of the winter fever before Evelina took her first breath." Cassian's jaw tightened. "I envy him. To be a man who can offer only a hearth and be enough, that is a luxury a king can never afford." He stood up and walked to a display case at the center of the room. Inside lay a jagged shard of obsidian, pulsing with a faint rhythmic violet light. This is the heart of the Vale. It is the source of the curse Leopold mentioned. My ancestor stole it from the moon altar to gain the power to defeat the first Ravenswood king. Into doing so, he bound our blood to the stone. We gained the strength of the great wolf, but we lost the ability to choose our own hearts. We are slaves to the moon's whim. He looked at Melisande, his expression raw. When the mark appeared on you, it wasn't just a sign of a mate, it was the stone recognizing its half. You are the key to the curse, Melisande. If I claim you fully, the stone goes dark, and the power of the Wolfthorne Alphas becomes human once more. My people fear that. They fear being vulnerable. Melisande walked to the case, her hand hovering over the glass. You would lose your power? Your strength? I would gain my soul, Cassian said, stepping closer. I would be able to feel the sun on my back without the beast screaming to kill it. I would be able to look at you and know that I chose you, not that the stone demanded you. The vulnerability in his voice shattered the last of her defenses. She reached out, her fingers brushing the back of his hand, the one with the matching mark. The spark was there again, but this time it wasn't a shock. It was a warmth that spread through her veins like wine. Is that why they hate me? She asked. Because I am the end of their monster? They hate you because they cannot control you, Cassian replied. He turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers, and because they see that I am already yours. He led her to the balcony, where the winter air was crisp and clear. The moon was a sliver of silver in the sky, a broken mirror reflecting the jagged landscape. Teach me, Melisande whispered. Teach me how to be what they need. If I am to be a queen, I will not be a silent one. Cassian smiled, a genuine heartbreaking expression that transformed his rugged face. I will teach you the fire, Melisande, but you must teach me the ice. You must teach me how to be still. They stood there for a long time, two shadows against the vast, indifferent night. But in the courtyard below, hidden in the darkness of the stables, Callista Ravenswood watched them. Her eyes were not amber, but a cold, calculating violet. She held a small silver whistle in her hand, a tool for calling things that lived in the deepest parts of the forest. She blew a silent note, and far off in the woods, something ancient and hungry answered. The Council of the Five Peaks was a gathering of the highest lords and ladies of the northern territories. It was meant to be a discussion of grain stores and border patrols, but as Melisande entered the chamber on Cassian's arm, the room became a theater of unspoken judgment. She wore a gown of silver-gray velvet, her hair braided with small crystalline stars. Beside her, Cassian was a tower of dark iron, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. Evander stood at the door, his hand on his sword, his eyes scanning the room for any hint of disrespect. "My lords," Cassian announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, "I present to you Melisande Thornbrook. She is the chosen of the moon, and she will sit by my side." A low murmur rippled through the room. Leopold stood at the far end of the long table, his face a mask of neutrality. Callista Ravenswood sat among her kin, her expression one of amused detachment. "A maid, sire?" one of the elder lords asked, his voice shaking with indignation. "The prophecy speaks of a daughter of the stars, not a daughter of the scullery." "The stars do not care for your titles, Lord Halloway," Cassian replied, his amber eyes flashing. "The mark is the only law that matters." Melisande felt the weight of their stares, 100 invisible needles pricking her skin. She remembered the heat of the kitchens, the way her back used to ache after a day of scrubbing. She drew that memory into herself, using it as a shield. She was not a lady of the court, but she was a woman who had survived the winter alone. She was stronger than any of them. "The Alpha speaks of law," Callista said, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a silken blade. "But what of the child, the girl with the stormy eyes who calls a maid mother? If this woman is the Alpha's mate, what is the girl to the throne? A bastard of a woodcutter or a threat to the succession?" The room went silent. Melisande felt a surge of cold fury. She stepped forward, breaking her silence for the first time. "My daughter is a child of this kingdom," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "She has more courage in her smallest finger than any of you who whisper in the dark. If you wish to challenge her place, challenge mine first." Cassian looked at her, his expression a mix of pride and warning. "The child is under my protection," the king declared. "Any word against her is a word against the crown." The meeting dissolved into a tense, chaotic debate, but the damage was done. As the lords filed out, Callista passed Melisande, leaning in close. "A brave speech, little maid," she whispered, "but courage doesn't stop a wolf from biting. You should check on your daughter. The nursery can be so drafty this time of year." Melisande's blood ran cold. She didn't wait for Cassian. She turned and sprinted toward the north tower, her skirts bunched in her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Evelina!" she cried, bursting into the inner chamber. The room was empty. The silk sheets were rumpled, a single charcoal drawing of a wolf lying on the floor. The window was wide open, the curtains fluttering in the icy wind. On the windowsill sat a single silver raven feather. A low growl erupted from the doorway. Cassian was there, his form already beginning to ripple and expand, the beast within him sensing the loss. "Ravenswood," he breathed, the word a distorted snarl. Outside, the first real blizzard of the season began to howl, white flakes obscuring the world. Somewhere in that white void, a child was being taken, and the Alpha King's restraint was finally irrevocably shattered. "Evander!" Cassian roared, his voice shaking the stones. "Sound the horn! We hunt tonight!" Melisande stood by the open window, the snow stinging her eyes. She didn't feel fear. She felt a cold, crystalline clarity. The maid was gone. The mother remained, and God help anyone who stood between her and her child. The world was no longer comprised of stone and sky. It was a wall of screaming, horizontal white. The blizzard did not just fall, it hunted, clawing at the eyes and lungs of any creature foolish enough to brave the pass. Behind the iron citadel, the jagged teeth of the mountains disappeared into the swirl. But for Melisande, the storm was not an obstacle. It was a scent, a vibration, a tether. She sat astride a massive gray destrier, her fingers frozen to the reins despite the thick fur gloves. Every breath felt like swallowing needles of ice, yet she refused to fall back. Ahead of her, a shadow moved through the drifts with a fluid, terrifying grace. It was not a man. It was a beast the size of a carriage, its fur as black as a starless night, its eyes two burning embers of amber gold. Cassian had shed his human skin the moment they crossed the outer gates. In his wolf form, he was the literal embodiment of the North's fury, a primal force that seemed to push back the wind itself. Evander Greyford and a dozen elite scouts followed, their horses huffing great plumes of steam that vanished instantly into the gale. They moved in a silence that felt heavy and expectant. There was no room for orders or status here. There was only the hunt. Melisande's mark on her neck was no longer just warm. It was a beacon. It thrummed with a frantic staccato pulse that mirrored the heartbeat of her child. Through the bond, she didn't just feel fear. She felt the sharp metallic tang of the silver dagger near Evelina's throat. She felt the cold stone beneath the girl's small feet. But beneath the terror, she felt Evelina's stubbornness, a quiet, crystalline resilience. Her daughter was not crying. She was waiting for the wolf. The great wolf stopped abruptly. He lifted his massive head, the snow matting his fur into jagged spikes. A low, vibrating snarl rumbled through the air, shaking the very pine trees that stood like frozen sentinels around them. The sound was so deep it vibrated in Melisande's marrow. "Sire!" Evander called out, his voice barely a ghost in the wind. The wolf turned, his amber eyes locking onto Melisande. The intelligence in those eyes was startling, a man trapped in a god's body. He stepped toward her, his breath a hot cloud that momentarily thawed the frost on her eyelashes. He nudged her knee with his snout, a gesture of both protection and urgency. He had found the trail. The scent of raven magic, sour and ozone thick, was cutting through the purity of the snow. They reached the Black Gorge by midnight. The Ravenswood stronghold, a fortress carved into the side of a cliff like a jagged wound, loomed above them. Silver banners, heavy with ice, whipped violently in the wind, sounding like the cracking of bones. There were no guards at the gate. Callista Ravenswood had left the path clear. She wanted the Alpha King in her lair, where the ancient dampening stones of the gorge could sap his strength. "They are expecting us," Melisande whispered, sliding off her horse. Her legs were numb, nearly buckling beneath her, but her resolve was a sharpened blade. The great wolf shifted. The sound was a gruesome symphony, the snapping of bone, the wet slide of muscle, the stretching of skin. Within seconds, Cassian stood before her, naked to the waist despite the sub-zero temperatures, his skin radiating a supernatural heat that melted the snow where he stood. He draped a heavy fur cloak over his shoulders, his eyes never leaving the dark maw of the fortress gates. "She has the girl in the inner sanctum," Cassian said, his voice raspy, as if his throat were still adjusting to human speech. "Near the moon altar. She thinks to use the child's innocence to bridge the heart of the Vale. She wants to drink the power that has kept my line cursed for centuries." "Then we give her the storm instead," Melisande said, her voice steady. Cassian looked at her, truly looked at her. In the darkness of the gorge, the silver marks on his wrist and her neck began to glow with a soft, ethereal light, casting a pale violet hue on the surrounding drifts. The bond was no longer a secret, it was a weapon. "You are not the woman who scrubbed my floors anymore, Melisande." "I never was," she replied, her eyes flashing. "I was only a mother in hiding, and now I'm a mother who has found her way home." They moved into the throat of the fortress. The air changed instantly, from the clean, biting cold of the mountain to a stagnant, suffocating heat. The walls were lined with silver raven feathers, each one etched with runes that hummed with a sickly, sweet magic. As they progressed, Melisande felt her strength flagging, her head swimming with the scent of old blood and ancient incense. In the center of the sanctum, beneath a ceiling open to the raging sky, stood Callista. She held Evelina by the hand. The girl looked small and fragile against the backdrop of the massive obsidian altar, but she stood tall, her stormy eyes fixed on the shadows where her mother and the king emerged. "One more step, Alpha," Callista's voice rang out, melodic and mocking, echoing off the high, arched ribs of the chamber. "And I let the moon decide if this child is truly worth your crown." She held a jagged silver dagger to the girl's throat, but it wasn't the blade that terrified Melisande. It was the way the obsidian altar was beginning to pulse with a dark, violent light. The heart of the Vale was reacting to the proximity of the true mates, its ancient hunger awakened by the very blood it had been designed to enslave. The inner sanctum was a cathedral of ice and malice. Callista stood at the edge of the moon altar, her violet eyes gleaming with a feverish, manic light. Behind her, the blizzard poured through the open roof, dusting the obsidian floor with white, creating a stark contrast to the dark, pulsing stone of the altar. "You've grown sentimental, Cassian," Callista said, her fingers tightening on the silver dagger. Evelina didn't flinch, though a single drop of blood, bright as a winter berry, appeared where the blade touched her porcelain skin. The great wolf of the north, brought to his knees by a scullery maid and a child of no name. Leopold was right. You are a weakness to your people. A king who loves is a king who can be broken. Cassian stepped forward, his bare feet silent on the cold stone. Every muscle in his body was taut, a hair trigger of violence held back by the thin thread of his will. "Let the girl go, Callista. This is between the Wolfthorne and the Ravenswood. The girl has no part in your ancient grudges." "She has every part," Callista hissed, gesturing to the altar. The obsidian shard was glowing fiercely now, the violet light turning into a jagged electric white that illuminated the cracks in the ceiling. "The stone craves balance. It has been dormant because you refused to mate with a line of power. You chose her, and in doing so, you've made the stone vulnerable. It wants to be whole again. It wants the life force of the one the moon loves most to seal the breach." She looked at Evelina with a predatory hunger. "The child is the bridge. Her blood, untainted by the lineage of the curse, will allow me to draw the power from the stone without the burden of the wolf. I will have the strength of the Alpha without the beast's madness." Melisande felt a roar rising in her throat, not a wolf's roar, but a mother's primal scream. She stepped out from behind Cassian, her silver-gray velvet gown torn and stained with the journey. "You speak of power as if it's a garment you can put on. You don't know what that stone is, Callista. I felt it the moment I entered this room. It isn't a source, it's a prison. It has fed on the Wolfthorns for 1,000 years. It doesn't want to give you power, it wants to consume you." "Then I shall be its warden," Callista screamed, her voice cracking. She raised the dagger, the silver reflecting the chaotic light of the altar. But before she could strike, a sound echoed through the chamber that silenced the wind itself. It was a high, clear note, a song of silver and light, like the ringing of a crystal bell in a silent forest. Evelina had reached out and touched the obsidian altar. The girl's small, pale hand rested on the pulsing stone. For a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to stop. The wind died. The fire in the braziers froze. Then, the silver mark on Melisande's neck and the mark on Cassian's wrist erupted in a blinding, synchronized flash. The energy didn't strike Callista. It flowed through the child. Evelina looked up at her mother, her eyes no longer stormy gray, but a brilliant crystalline silver that seemed to hold the light of 1,000 moons. "Mama," she whispered, her voice sounding far away yet incredibly clear. "The stone is sad. It's been waiting for someone to tell it that it can go home." The heart of the Vale began to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that made the very foundations of the cliff groan. The obsidian began to crack, and from the fissures, a pure violet light poured out, washing over the room. Callista stumbled back, the dagger falling from her hands as the dark magic she had gathered was stripped away, neutralized by the purity of the child's empathy. "No! My power!" Callista cried, reaching desperately for the stone. But the obsidian shard was no longer a solid thing. It was liquefying, turning into a swirl of violet smoke and starlight. Cassian seized the moment. He didn't shift into the wolf. He moved with the speed of the man he was becoming, the man he had always been beneath the fur. He tackled Callista, hurling her away from the altar and into the shadows of the colonnade. He didn't kill her with his claws. He didn't have to. The vacuum of magic she had created within herself now turned inward. The cold of the gorge rushed into her empty soul, freezing her where she stood until she was nothing more than a statue of ice, her face forever twisted in a mask of greed. Cassian turned back to the altar, his face contorted in agony. The bond was pulling at him, trying to anchor his very soul to the stone as it dissolved. He was the last of the cursed line. If the stone vanished, the magic that sustained his lineage would go with it. "Cassian!" Grar. Melisande ran to the altar, grabbing Evelina and pulling her into her arms. The girl was shivering, the silver light fading from her eyes. Melisande reached for Cassian with her free hand. The moment their skin met, the triangle was complete. The maid, the king, and the child. The silver marks on their skin began to glow one last time, manifesting as literal threads of light that wove themselves into the dissolving obsidian. "The choice!" Cassian gasped, his eyes shifting rapidly between amber gold and a deep human brown. "Melisande, if I let go of the wolf, the protection of the crown falls. I will be just a man. I cannot protect you with the strength of the beast." "I don't need a monster to protect me," Melisande said, her voice a firm, unyielding anchor. "I need a husband who can hold me without fear. I need a father for my daughter who can teach her to walk in the sun. Choose us, Cassian. Choose the life we can build, not the one we were forced to endure." With a final guttural cry that sounded like the breaking of 1,000 chains, Cassian leaned in and kissed her. It was a kiss of salt and sweat, of desperation and hope. It was a human claim. The explosion was silent. A wave of intense warmth rolled out from the altar, instantly melting the snow in the sanctum and turning the air to the sweetness of a spring morning. The obsidian shattered into 1,000 harmless, dull pebbles. The violet light flickered once and then died, replaced by the soft, natural glow of a full moon that was finally, truly whole. Silence descended. The blizzard outside had vanished, as if it had never been. Cassian collapsed to his knees, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He looked at his hands. They were steady, the skin pale and human. The silver mark was gone. He looked at Melisande. Her neck was smooth. The jagged lines of the curse vanished, leaving only the warmth of her skin. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched Evelina's cheek. The girl smiled, her eyes returning to their natural gray, though a tiny spark of silver remained deep in her pupils. "The wolf is gone," Cassian whispered, his voice sounding lighter, stripped of the growl that had haunted it for years. "No," Melisande said, pulling him into their embrace as the dawn began to bleed over the horizon. "The wolf is home, and for the first time in 1,000 years, so are we." The return to the Iron Citadel was not a march of war, but a procession of peace that the North had never seen. The spring had come early to the Vale, as if the land itself were exhaling. The snow receded with impossible speed, revealing fields of mountain primrose and wild heather that bloomed in the wake of the king's passing. The people of the citadel stood at the gates, the cooks, the stable hands, the high lords, and the weary soldiers. They didn't cower in the shadows this time. They watched in hushed awe as Cassian Wolfthorne rode in. He was not on a black charger, and he did not wear the heavy, intimidating furs of the Alpha. He rode a sturdy brown horse, wearing a simple tunic of forest green wool. Beside him rode Melisande, her head held high, her dark curls caught in a simple silver circlet that had belonged to his mother. And between them, sitting proudly on her own pony, was Evelina. Leopold Valahart stood at the top of the great stairs, his face the color of parchment. He looked at the king, the man who no longer smelled of blood and primal fury, but of the earth, the pines, and the morning sun. "Sire," Leopold began, his voice wavering, his eyes searching for the glow of the amber eyes he had served for decades. "The stone. The reports say the heart has been unmade. The power of the Wolfthorne lineage." "The power of the Wolfthorne is in its people, Leopold," Cassian said, dismounting with a grace that was now entirely human. He walked up the stairs, his stride steady. He didn't look like a beast in human skin anymore. He looked like a leader who had finally found his soul. "The curse is broken. We are no longer slaves to a shard of rock or the phases of the moon. We are free to build a kingdom that doesn't rely on the fear of the dark." He turned and reached out a hand to Melisande as she joined him on the stairs. She took it, her fingers interlacing with his. "The council will have questions about the bloodlines," Leopold whispered, ever the administrator. "They will say the strength of the North has been diluted." "The bloodlines are rewritten," Cassian declared, his voice carrying to the very edges of the courtyard. "This is Melisande Wolfthorne, my queen, and this is Evelina, princess of the Vale. Any who wish to challenge their place may speak now, or they may find their own way in the new world we are building. A world where a maid can be a queen, and a king can be a man." No one spoke. Instead, a low cheer began in the back of the crowd, from the kitchens where Melisande had once scrubbed, and it grew into a roar that echoed off the obsidian walls. It wasn't the roar of a wolf, it was the sound of a people who had been holding their breath for 100 years, finally allowed to breathe. That night, there was no feast of state. There were no gilded cages or whispered judgments. The great hall was filled with the sense of a true home, fresh bread, roasting herbs, and the genuine laughter of children. Melisande sat by the hearth in their private quarters later that evening, watching as Cassian sat on the rug with Evelina. He was showing her how to carve a wolf out of a piece of fragrant cedar, his large, scarred hands moving with a gentleness that was breathtaking. "She has your eyes," Cassian said, looking up at Melisande. The firelight played across his face, softening the lines of worry that had been etched there for a lifetime. "And she has your spirit," she replied, kneeling beside them, "the courage to touch the dark and find the light within it." He stood up and pulled Melisande into his arms. The window was open, the night air cool and sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine. The moon hung high and full in the sky, no longer a symbol of a shattered soul or a looming change, but a lantern for a new journey. "I spent my whole life thinking I was a king because of a mark on my skin," Cassian whispered into her hair, his heart beating a steady human rhythm against hers. "I didn't realize I was only a king because I finally had something worth protecting with my life, rather than my teeth." "You are a king because you chose to be a man," Melisande said, pulling him down for a kiss that tasted of freedom. They stood there in the quiet of their own making, a maid and a monarch who had found each other in the shadows of a curse. The winter was over. The story of the Alpha King and the Maid's daughter had reached its end, but the story of the family they had become was only on its first beautiful page. Epilogue. The Song of the Forest. Years later, travelers through the northern marches would tell stories of a queen who walked among the people without a guard, her hands as comfortable with a wash basin as they were with a scepter. They would speak of a king who listened more than he roared, and of a princess whose stormy eyes saw the truth in every soul she met. The iron citadel remained, its obsidian walls now softened by climbing ivy, vibrant moss, and the constant joyful noise of a growing pack of children. But the true heart of the kingdom was no longer in the stone. It was in the way the morning light hit the valley, in the way the forest sang when the wind was just right, and in the way a simple mark, once a sign of a curse, had become a legend of a love that defied the stars. The moon rose over the peaks, full and bright, casting a silver path across the world. And deep in the woods, the wolves still howled, not in hunger, not in madness, but in a song of freedom that would echo for generations to come. This story is a testament to the idea that our destinies are not written in stone, but in the choices we make for the people we love. Cassian and Melisande's journey from the isolation of power and the shadows of servitude to a shared life of freedom highlights the transformative strength of the human heart. Through the innocence of a child and the resilience of a mother, a kingdom was saved not by ancient blood, but by the breaking of ancient chains. Their love stands as a beacon, proving that even the most formidable curses can be shattered by the simple, profound truth of belonging and the courage to choose the sun over the shadow. If you enjoyed this cinematic journey through the Iron Citadel, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales of destiny, romance, and the magic that lives in the spaces between heartbeats. Let us know in the comments, what would you sacrifice for your true mate?